All right, last bit of chapter 5. So for this section, focusing on the nervous and muscular tissues and going through their features and then more specifics on each type, including all 3 types of muscle, which is skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. So both nervous and muscular tissue are excitable. So these types of tissues are able to be stimulated, so they will respond to this stimulation depending on the type of tissue. So in order to respond, it's based off the membrane potential. So we learned in chapter 3, I believe, the sodium-potassium pumps that are constantly pumping sodium and potassium across the cell membrane. That actually helps us to maintain our membrane potential across the cell, and so when we have that change in voltage, these types of tissues are able to respond due to that stimuli. So in nerve cells, it's a rapid transmission of the signal to another cell. In muscles, it causes a shortening of the cells, which is called a contraction. Okay, nervous tissue by itself. So this type of tissue is the type of cells that make up your nerves as well as your brain. So it specializes in electrical and chemical communication. Most of your nervous tissue is mostly neurons, so these big giant ones here, they will detect stimuli in the dendrites, respond, and then send off that communication. So all of this is electrical. We get a chemical signal from the first cell, electrical one sent through our nerve cell or our neuron. And then at the end, it transforms to a chemical signal so that it can signal the next cell. So this information is coded, so there is a specific pattern of information, how fast that electrical signal travels. That's going to help our brain code what the information is. The other type of cells, which are actually outnumber your neurons, are your neuroglial cells. So these just help with the functions of the neurons. We're still actually learning about them, but they are, in this picture, cartoon of course, are the little small ones. So they greatly outnumber your neurons, but we'll talk about them more in chapter 14. Okay, parts of a neuron. So we got our dendrites. These are our signal receivers. So very at the top here of our neuron. So their job is to receive the signals. That signal then gets sent to the neurosoma, which is your main cell body. So your nucleus is there. You also have your other organelles. So for example, for making proteins, all of that is done in our neurosoma, and then it can be trafficked to other areas of our neuron. Okay, next part is the axon. That's going to send the signal to the target cells for whatever function needs to happen, either a gland to release a product or a muscle cell or just another neuron. Okay, now moving on to muscular tissue. So we're talking about all 3 types in general. Their job is to contract or shorten in response to a stimulation. So when they shorten, they contract, that allows for either movement of, for example, our body using the muscles attached to our skeletal system, or movement, for example, say in our heart, getting the blood to go around. It's also an important source of body heat. So when muscles use ATP, so our energy storing molecule, the energy that is released is not completely efficiently used in muscles. So what is lost as heat, and that also helps our body maintain our body temperature of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. So with our muscular tissue, we have 3 types: skeletal, attached to your skeleton; cardiac, creating your heart; and smooth, which creates your hollow internal organs, for example, like your stomach. Okay, skeletal muscle tissue. So again, most of it attached to the bone. You do have a few that aren't, like the muscles that control your eye opening as well as the muscles that control your anus opening. With our skeletal muscle, they have multiple nuclei. So here we have a skeletal muscle cell up here, and you actually can see two of the nuclei there. And the reason being is because during their development, the precursor cells, the kind of like seed cells, they merge together, but the nuclei don't merge, and so that's how you end up with multiple nuclei. Another feature is the striation. So these are the little stripe patterns there. We'll talk about this more in the muscle system chapter, but the striations are caused by alternating dark and light bands, and this is based on the fiber proteins that are inside those cells that actually are what allows the skeletal muscle cell to shorten and contract. Last feature is that it's voluntary, so we have conscious control over those muscles. So for example, if I have my hand, I can tell which finger to move because that's what my brain wants it to do. However, with your other two muscle types, your cardiac, making up your heart, as well as your smooth for your internal organs, you don't have conscious control over them. So you can't tell your body to calm your heart rate down just by a brain command. Okay, cardiac muscle. So again, muscle that creates your heart. So with our cardiac muscle cells, they are branched. So they're not just one straight type of cell going in one direction. We have multiple branches off of a cell. They are shorter than skeletal muscle fibers. So instead of like earlier picture we saw where we saw these big long cells, here, I'm going to go to the cartoon on this side, we actually have a lot shorter cell. And part of that's also because of the structure it's creating. So it's creating this 3D open shape with all these chambers inside the heart. So being shorter actually helps with that. So in between these cells, we have our intercalated discs. So that's the stripes that we see on our picture here. They provide electrical and mechanical connections. So getting all of these heart muscle cells to contract at the same time, you allow the signal, which is ion-based, to pass through your intercalated disc, and that way it causes all of them to contract at the same time. It also provides a mechanical connection, so it just keeps the cells together. Last one. It is striated, so stripes just like our skeletal muscle cells, but it is involuntary. So again, we don't have conscious control over it. Now, let's say you were running or whatever, and your heart rate is up. You can't like just tell your body to calm it down. You could try to control your breathing. So slowing down your breathing will slow down your heart rate. And that's because they're tied together. So if you start breathing faster, your heart rate's going to go up and vice versa. But you can't just send a brain command to your heart to tell it to slow down. Okay, last muscle type, which is our smooth muscle. So smooth muscle, the shape of it is fusiform, so our little stretched out football shape. They don't have striations, so that's why they're smooth compared to striated. They have one nucleus here in the center, and actually I'm going to go back to our cardiac. Cardiac also has one nucleus, but it also has, with this white stuff you see on the outside, that's actually glycogen storage. So the glycogen is where basically your muscle just keeps its own energy source to make sure that it has the glucose, which is stored as glycogen, has that source so it can always be fueled. Okay, back to our smooth muscle. Okay, so it's also involuntary, just like our cardiac muscle, so we can't send a brain command to tell it to speed up, slow down. So for example, our stomach is made up of smooth muscle, so we can't be like, hey, hurry up, digest, because I want to eat dessert. Doesn't work that way. Okay, so most of our smooth muscle is visceral muscle, so visceral referring to our internal organs. So it helps to make up the walls on the outside. Usually it's kind of like in the middle of it. So for example, like your stomach, there's a epithelial layer on the inside, and then you have a muscle layer, and then on the outside you have a connective tissue layer. Okay, so this chart actually puts all of them together on one page. Skeletal, cardiac, and smooth, and listing whether or not they have striations. We have voluntary control over them. How many nuclei? Do they have intercalated discs? Where are they located and what their function? location of function, excuse me. Okay, next section, yeah, because I got 2 more sections. Well, this one and another one, is our cell junctions, glands, and membranes. Okay, so for our cell junctions, I'm actually only going to cover 2 because those are the ones on the study guide. So we have tight junctions and gap junctions, which are the ones I'm going to cover. So for tight junctions, this is where you have a very limited space between your 2 cells. So I'm actually going to go to this other picture. So up here would be where the tight junctions are. So keeping our cells closely linked to each other. So you can have a linky tight junction where water and anything that is dissolved in water, so it's solutes, are able to pass between a cell. So sometimes when you have, for example, absorption of nutrients, they can actually also pass through there if the molecule is small enough to be dissolved in water. Okay, next one, gap junctions. So this has a ring of proteins and this tiny little hole, and that's where little small stuff can go from cell to cell. So for example, ions, different nutrients, anything small enough to get through that hole, it can get there going down its concentration gradient from high to low concentration. So these types of cells are These types of cell junctions are located in cardiac, smooth, and embryonic tissue. So, in our cardiac muscle, so even though that's a simplified heart, that signal is going to go from down here at the bottom where the apex is, so our little pointy portion of our heart, and move up our heart tissue in order to get the muscle to contract at the same time. Next one for our smooth muscle. So instead of having a direct signal from a neuron, you have one that's kind of in the generic area, and then the gap junctions kind of help spread out that signal to get the other cells to contract as well. And then the last one for embryonic tissue, it helps your cells of the embryo know what part of the body it is, where it's located, and so that you're able to know the difference between the cells that should make up your head versus the cells that should make up your butt. So keeping everything dispersed, and so you don't have body parts being grown in the wrong areas. Okay, moving on to glands. So with our glands, we have 2 different types of glands. We have exocrine glands and endocrine glands. So way to remember where your stuff is going. Exocrine glands are going to use a duct system to exit out of the body or exit out of the gland itself. So some of them are external, so like sweat or tears going out of your body, or they can have a duct to take their product to another part of the body but still stays inside. So salivary glands making our saliva or spit, so that goes into the mouth. Pancreas creates a product, well, it creates a bunch of products, but creates a product that can be excreted out of the duct system going into the small intestines, and that helps with digestion. Endocrine glands, so this endo, inside, those types of glands secrete their product into the bloodstream. So normally this product is some type of hormones. So examples of these types of glands, you have your thyroid gland found in your throat area. So a lot of that's metabolism. Your adrenal gland, so making adrenaline. So those sit on top of your kidneys, usually. And your pituitary gland, which is the little hangy gland that hangs from the bottom of your brain. That actually is one of your major hormone controlling glands, even though it's like super small. But a lot of your development and body control actually comes from that gland. Should be on this list. I just didn't put it on there. I keep forgetting. Pancreas also is an endocrine gland because it makes insulin, which helps us to regulate our... Oh, darn, there it is. Some that are both endocrine and exocrine. Read. It's fundamental. Okay, so pancreas being one that, for example, creating insulin to control blood sugar. Our gonads creating a exocrine product such as our sex cells, so a sperm and egg, and then also producing our sex hormones. Not really sex hormones. Anyway, testosterone, progesterone, and estrogen. The liver just does way too much work. It does a ton of crap, and so no surprise, it's also exocrine and endocrine. Okay. So just a picture version so you can see it. Endocrine gland secreting into the bloodstream. Exocrine gland using a duct system to get its product to the outside. That one. Okay, cool. Okay, so for the next section, we got our exocrine glands. We're going to focus on 3 ways how it's able to release its product. So we have merocrine, apocrine, and holocrine. So for merocrine secretion, you have a product that is packaged into a vesicle, and then that vesicle, through exocytosis, is able to release the product out of the cell. So an example of this is the more watery secretion, the milk and sugar that is created to create milk in the mammary glands. So the carbohydrate and proteins that a baby needs, that portion of breast milk is coming through merocrine secretion. Excuse me. Next type is apocrine secretion. So in this one, we have our product that's made, but it's packaged using our plasma membrane and buds from the surface in order to release the product out from the cell. So example of this is the lipid portion, so our fats that the baby needs. So we get all of our macronutrients. So we get our protein, our carbohydrates, and our lipids all in that milk. That milk fat is packaged in that plasma membrane. So over here in the corner, we have breast milk under a microscope. So that breast milk is, you can see the packages of lipids inside the breast milk. So, and this isn't like, okay, this might have been an artifact because it was prepared. No, I actually had a student who literally went to the bathroom, pumped a little, made a slide, and it was exactly like this. She just thought that was kind of cool, and she was like, oh, let me see it. Okay, anyway. Last type of secretion is holocrine secretion. So, for example, your oil glands create their product and secrete it in this manner. So your product is created here in the bottom part of your gland, and then slowly it pushes up toward the surface. So just like with epithelial cells, epithelial tissue, the cells away from the basement membrane, away from the nutrients, end up dying off. So part of the oil that's on your skin is also dead cells that were originally making the oil product. So down here we have our newer daughter cells, older ones get pushed up, and so you have the cells that died off become actually part of your product. Okay, next section is membranes. There are some tissues that are made of multiple membranes. I'm only going to focus on mucus because that's the one that is on your study guide. Okay, so here we have a mucous membrane. So a membrane is going to have multiple tissue types. So here at the bottom we have a muscle layer, and then we have this one, which is a connective tissue layer, particularly your loose connective areolar tissue. So loosely organized bunch of blood vessels so we can feed this epithelial tissue layer, bunch of white blood cells just in case something tries to cross and comes into the body. Okay, this top layer, there's your epithelial layer, so our cells tightly packed with each other along a basement membrane, so that separates your epithelial layer and your connective tissue layer. This particular type being our pseudostratified columnar type of epithelial tissue, so even though it looks like they're stacked on top of each other, every single cell touches the basement membrane. So in our mucous membrane, we have our goblet cells. Those are our unicellular or one cell glands, and their job is to create mucus. At the top of this, we have these cilia. So those cell extensions that we learned about in chapter 3. So those cilia are going to push the product in one direction, therefore able to keep moving the newly created mucus that come from those goblet cells. So again, goblet cells that kind of look like a goblet, which is an old version word for saying a wine glass. Okay, mucous membrane. Oh, last one, tissue repair. Let's go. Okay, so I'm going to go over tissue repair. Once I find it, there we go. We got two types of tissue repair. So once you have some kind of damage, depending on the type of tissue, your type of repair is going to be either through regeneration, where the cells that were damaged gets restored by creating new cells that are going to fill in that space. You have return of normal function of that type of cell. So up here in our example, we have a cut through the skin. And this upper layer, our epithelial epidermis tissue layer, that's going to repair itself using regeneration, new cells filling in that spot. Next type is fibrosis. So down here in our dermal tissue layer, our connective tissue below our epithelial tissue in the skin. So in that case, the tissue repair is through fibrosis. So instead of having cells replace it, new fibrous proteins are created in that space to fill in the gap. So here in this example, for example, this would be a loose connective areolar type of connective tissue. So there's a bunch of fibers that run through there. So the fibroblasts, remember, our builder cells, those builder cells are going to come through, make a bunch of new collagen, new reticular fibers, new elastic fibers, fill in that gap space, and you're stuck with this scar tissue that is non-functional, so it does not restore function. So one difference, like for example, if you want to look at muscle, smooth muscle repairs by regeneration. So you're going to have a restored normal function. Cardiac tissue does not. So you have a heart attack, you're going to end up with a piece of scar tissue that does not function, so your heart's not as efficient. So please take care of yourself. Ask me questions if you need to. Fill out that study guide. Thanks for listening.